Welcome to the Plato Paradigm, a paradigm shift in reading Plato's dialogues. Episode 80, Meno 71d to 72a. Socrates has hooked Meno by saying that he has never met anyone who knew what arete was, or rather anyone who could answer the question what arete or virtue is. Now, Meno knows that Gorgias has answers for everything, so he's very surprised that Socrates never heard Gorgias when Gorgias was in Attica, dispensing Sophia to the rich people then, as he is now doing in Thessaly. This gives Socrates the opportunity to request from Meno a reminder of what Gorgias might have said then, because Meno has heard and learned the answers which Gorgias typically gives on such subjects. The way Socrates puts it, what seems to Gorgias seems also to Meno. In other words, Meno and Gorgias share the same opinions. This isn't the case. Meno simply has learnt the answers that Gorgias gives. As far as Meno is concerned, that does mean that Meno thinks the way that Gorgias does. Having encouraged Meno to give Gorgias's answers, Socrates proceeds with an interesting step. Ekenon mentoinun eomen epede kai apestin, sude autos o prostheon menon, tifes areten enai. But let's leave that person out of it, since he's not here. You yourself, by the gods, Meno, what do you say virtue is? Does Socrates expect Meno to give his own answers now? Clearly not. He still expects Meno to give Gorgias's answers, but by leaving Gorgias out of this, Meno should take responsibility for what he says. Otherwise, Meno himself won't be engaged in the conversation. He'll simply be reporting the answers given by Gorgias. Epon kai me phthonese hina eutuchestaton psiusma epsius menos o anphanes su men eidos kai Gorgias egode erekos me deni popote edoti ente tuchekenai. Say, and don't be miserly, so that I will have been false with the most fortunate falsehood, if you appear to know just like Gorgias. Although I had said that I had never encountered anyone ever who knew. Telling Meno not to answer miserly is another way of encouraging Meno to answer generously in the style of Gorgias. A generous answer would usually involve several answers. One answer would be miserly. In other words, Socrates is already manipulating Meno to provide more than one answer, while later on he will say that isn't what he wanted. He only wanted one answer, what arete itself is, in one expression. We should also note that Socrates has already instilled the idea of mistakes, falsehoods, as a good thing. It's good to make mistakes because then, well, Socrates doesn't say what happens then, but we may imagine that someone who becomes aware of mistakes in one's thinking is then in a position to correct. Since Socrates has already mentioned making mistakes and that mistakes are a good thing, we may suspect that in this dialogue we'll see how mistakes can be corrected. It isn't necessarily the case, but we can suspect that Socrates will do something. By asking Meno to say what Gorgias thought, but actually now making it Meno's responsibility, these are Meno's ideas about arete, by making Meno reply, Socrates can then demonstrate to Meno in some way that these replies are false, which would then allow Meno to correct himself, if Meno is that sort of person. Correcting falsehoods is not something that a sophist does, or at least not something Gorgias does. He provides answers. He doesn't refute unless he's doing heuristics. And in heuristics, the opponent is not actually voicing his own opinions, but one of the two possibilities provided to him by the heuristician. Meno thinks that any of the answers given by Gorgias are examples of knowledge, and Socrates goes along with that for now, because if Meno provides one of those answers, or more than one of those answers, it proves that Meno knows, and therefore that Gorgias also knows. This, of course, is nonsense, but it is designed to encourage Meno to provide answers. Meno is happy to oblige. Al'u chalepono Socrates epen. But it isn't difficult, Socrates, to say, and actually saying that it isn't difficult to say is part of being generous, giving a generous answer. It's very impressive. Only someone who knows would be able to say that it isn't difficult to say what something is. Proton men e boule andros areten radion, hoti haute est in andros arete, hikonon enai tates poleos praten, kai pratonta tus men filus eupoien, tus dechrus kakos, kai auton iulabestai meden toiuton pathen. First of all, if you want the virtue of a man, it's easy, because this is the virtue of a man, to do the things of the polis, and in doing so, to benefit friends and to harm enemies or hostile people, and to be careful himself not to suffer such a thing, in other words, to be harmed by enemies. We can see from this that helping friends and harming enemies is nothing new. This has been the conventional morality for millennia. What's interesting here is that this is the point of running a polis. You don't manage a polis for the benefit of the polis, but in order to be able to help your friends and harm your enemies. This again shows that it's nothing new. Now, this is considered to be the virtue of a man. In other words, a good man is one who manages the polis in order to help friends and harm enemies, and to avoid being harmed by enemies. Edibule gunaikos areten, uchalepon delthen, hoti te auten ten oikian eu oiken, so zusante ta endon kai katekoon usan tu andros. If you want the virtue of a woman, it's not difficult to detail, because she has to manage the household well, preserving the things inside while being obedient to her man, her husband. There's a parallel here between the two virtues. The virtue of the man is to manage the polis, while the virtue of the woman is to manage the household. There is a hierarchy. The woman is obedient to the man, but all the other members of the household would be obedient to the woman. One interesting addition here is that the woman has to manage the household well. This wasn't said about the man. He doesn't have to manage the polis well. The assumption is that if he helps his friends and harms his enemies, then he's doing well. As if two virtues weren't enough, Meno generously adds a few more. Kai alle estin paidos arete, kai theleas, kai arenos, kai presbyteru andros, emin bule eleutheru, edibule dulu. And there's another virtue of a child, both a female and a male, in other words, they have different virtues, and of an older man, if you want a free one, or if you want a slave. So we see in this generous answer that virtue is identified with a role befitting a person according to gender, age, and social status. This, in fact, is a point made by Meno himself as he sums up this list of virtues. Kai allai pampolai aretaesin, hoste uk aporie pen aretes peri hotiestin. Kathekasten gar ton praxion kai ton helikion, pros hekaston ergon hekasto hemon he areteestin. Hos autos de oimai o Socrates kai he kakia. And there are very many other virtues, so that there is no aporia, shortage, lack, difficulty, to say about virtue what it is. For virtue is according to each of the actions and age groups pertaining to every task to each of us. And the same, I think, Socrates also is vice. Part of the generosity of such answers is not simply the number of definitions given in the answer, but also saying that there are many more without going into details. And in this case, we also have the throwaway line at the end that vice must be like virtue. This is slightly problematic because while virtue is distinct and defined and limited to one or two very clear actions, the opposite is a list of all the actions which are inappropriate for a particular person to do. Perhaps the idea is that it is inappropriate for a particular person to do any of the roles of other particular persons. For example, it would be inappropriate for a man to simply run the household and inappropriate for a woman to run the polis. Meno is also being generous in his answer by saying all the time, well, if you want this, if you want that. But as we'll see, Socrates doesn't want a type of virtue. He doesn't want the virtue of a man, of a woman, of a child, of an old man. He wants to know what virtue itself is. This is what he will be saying later on. And so it's interesting that he has encouraged Meno to give a typical answer by Gorgias. And Socrates knows that Meno will give him a list of types of virtues. We should ask ourselves what Socrates is playing at.